So, the first question is the correlation between the internet and religion in our 21st century world due to this immediate inundation of media forms that would rather reduce faith down to a debatable topic rather than spend time exploring the collaborative faith and reason dynamic? There's a second question here, obviously. We will get to that in a second so we all don't get totally overwhelmed. But I'm going to throw it right here and we'll start with Michelle.
Right. Well, I was inspired for many reasons by that clip that we just saw of Neil deGrasse Tyson and his consideration that faith and reason are irreconcilable, right? And knowing that that was the rights theme for this year, I came into looking at the theater season wanting to grapple with this notion. And so in January, at the end of January, one of our main stage shows, which will be happening in the Black Box, is called Irreconcilable, ear in parentheses, right? And my aim with that piece, it's going to be an original work that I devised, hopefully with the help of folks in this room. So if you're interested, get my business card afterwards. It's going to be based on interview narratives I conduct with people on this campus, our students, and further afield about this very issue. Is it irreconcilable to you, or how do you reconcile faith and reason? For me personally, I find them very compatible, right? And I think it was a very intentional decision on the part of Richard to really think about it being faith and reason as the theme, rather than faith versus reason, correct, Richard? Yes. So I appreciate that distinction, and for me, it's not one that I have a hard time reconciling. So that's actually where we got the idea to have that clip kind of start us off, is because Richard thought, well, I'll put that on the Rights site as a way to get people to wrap their heads around this notion of reconcilable versus irreconcilable when it comes to this idea.
Thank you. My take of this question is a little bit different. I think I'm a clinical psychologist, and my training is very much rooted in European psychology. One of my teachers, Viktor Frankl, some of you may know. So for me, in therapy, we're talking about practice of science, not only am I focused on what I know in scientific knowledge, observations, and so forth that all come into play, but we have to be very open to the kind of experiences clients bring to us. Taking clients' experiences as legitimate and meaningful data is important. Not all my colleagues in the psychological world would take experience seriously, especially in the United States. Okay? But if you do take experience seriously, and this morning I just talked to a person who came to talk about the loss of faith related to Catholicism and related to the problems that she encountered. For me, I don't make judgments of whether the faith is real or not real, or whether it can reconcile with science or not. Someone's experience, someone's faithful experience, is as real as any other experience. So in that sense, for me, it's an observation. Experience is as much as real as observation of empirical observation. And I want to understand what that experience means in relation to the person's life. So it's the praxis of clinical work is very different than when I speak as a theoretician. All right, when I'm speaking about epistemology, when I'm speaking about methods of research. There, I think, is where you find points that it's very hard to reconcile. Because if I speak as a quote-unquote scientist, I'm dealing with events that can not only be observed, but repeated and publicly acknowledged. My hypothesis tends to be based on observation. My hypothesis can be demonstrated by evidence as acceptable or not, rejected. And there is always a reference to a public engagement in verification of what I'm studying. Okay? Clinical work has, especially individual clinical work, has the benefit of not having to deal with the research end of what we refer to as scientific method and work with the individual. There, I think, the reconciliation between faith is in the very construction of personal meaning.
Brad, 1 second, I want to ask Dr. Jack on that though. The public observation also include public in a digital sense? When you talk about the media and the inundation of that effect, would one, if you observe that, where does the influence, or do you just completely remove yourself and that individual from any inundation of a digital media world that is of the internet influence of this possible topic of debate, of the hard facts that we like to actually sort of hardline our stance left to right? There's no middle gray area. Where is that? I just
Well, for me, the internet is hardly the basis of scientific judgment.
But is there influence? But I understand, but as a mass public though, we may think that way, but is there influence?
I think any information, and I go back to culture study, that when we're looking at individuals being bombarded, they're very much a present, show me type of culture that we're in. We have this opinion that what is before us, right here, is more real than even thinking, thoughts, or feeling, anything that is not immediately there. So that to me is really a cultural fact than a scientific basis.
Okay, I'm gonna come back to you on this second part here, but I'll come back after you do.
Right, so for those of you that couldn't hear Neil deGrasse Tyson's voice because it was a little bit soft, he said God exists and explains everything. Tyson represents a very strong view, but historically there are 4 different possible ways that science and religion can interact, and different ones come into prominence in different ages. And I'm thinking here of the Gifford lecture by Ian Barber that talked about the 4 ways. One would be conflict, which Tyson seems to assume, or possibly Tyson fits into the second camp, which is that they're completely distinct and can't even talk to each other. They're just entirely separate. A third sort of view is kind of a dialogue view where science and religion are quite distinct, but at least they can talk to each other about their bearing on a third set of issues, perhaps. And the fourth is the view of some like biochemist Dr. Peacock and John Polkinghorne who say, no, integration. We can actually see science and religion be integrated. And this is the Templeton-funded research by Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences. So there's a lot of possible variations on how these things interact. When you ask the question here about the correlation between loss of faith, what we in the business of religious studies call the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, those that self-identify as having no religion, that has increased along with the rise of the internet. Okay, well there's 3 possibilities. One is that the correlation is that the increased internet use is driving loss of faith. The other possibility is it goes the other way. That loss of faith is increasing internet use. The third possibility is that it doesn't really matter. It's accidental. That there's no connection whatsoever. So I'm more interested in the field of research that I do in theological ethics, thinking about how we understand how we ought to live, well, kind of depends on who is the we.
Can you talk about that a little bit more? What do you mean by who is the
Sure.
we?
So that was a dramatic pause. I was going to go.
I felt the beat there, so sorry about that.
So in asking the question, how ought we live? The more serious question, the deeper question is who's the we? And if we understand ourselves, in former generations we would have said, I belong to this generation after generation after generation of Lutherans, or whatever your particular group is, Norwegian bachelor farmers, as Garrison Keillor likes to make fun of. But whoever the we is, that comes packaged with it, an understanding of what life is for and how to live well. And those kind of questions can be we can sort through the data with a scientific method, but that's not really what the science is after. It's kind of a different set of questions.
Dr. Pinnell?
So we were given these questions in advance to kind of prepare, and I will have to say as an engineer, I didn't even understand what they were asking.
Here's a diagram.
So I have to say, I don't know that I have a highly intellectual answer answer to provide, but I will say that I do not have any problem with faith and reason overlapping or anything like that. And I would say that a significant number of the engineering population here at UD also does not have a problem with that. We have some very faithful students, and they're motivated in making some really good engineering decisions based a lot on their faith and their understanding of their duties to uphold that. That being said, I think when I was looking at this, one of the things that I was thinking about is I separate religion and faith a little bit, and I oftentimes wonder if that part of the decline in religion has to do with the way that the media is portraying it as an excuse for hate and for bad behavior. So, Christians gone wild or Christians gone bad, whatever you want to call it, or whatever the denomination might be. But I think that the media does like to highlight some of those things, and because we do have immediate access to it, particularly the population that's making that decision, the college age, they're very tied to Twitter and all sorts of other things, that they're more exposed to some of those instances where religion is used as an excuse for hate and for other bad behavior.
So then, and speaking of that, then sort of also bridging into this second question, and actually going back to that we. You talk about that, Kallenberg? One of the questions I have then is the we, though, and depending on who we're talking about, it, the we of now, though, we have an access of knowledge, and I use that loosely again, viable versus non-viable knowledge that is on the internet. And I guess the question is, does the idea of, is there an easier access or understandable access to divide oneself from, and even what Dr. Pinnell said about the separation of religion versus faith in that sense. So when you sort of have this access of knowledge, so to speak, and it allows the human intellectual process to define what it wants to be, doesn't it? I mean, is that fair? I mean, if I have access to internet as this we generation, or this we as us, I then can go into that internet and drag and pull what I want to pull out of there, correct? So is that not sort of changing the times? Does the times dictate that?
Is it live now?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it, bro.
I have a couple different thoughts, and I suspect my panel will want to jump in anytime. On the one hand, we have to look at the scientific evidence that empirically what happened when the information superhighway opened up is we all drove in one lane. In the sense that when you have the free range to look at 400 different newspapers, you only read what your friends are reading. Right? So I asked my students about the Ebola crisis in East Africa, haven't you read any of these stories? And there was silence. And they said, well, on social media. That was their answer. So all the news they've gotten is just pings or clicks or whatever tweets or whatever. I mean, from friends to look at the possible this, that, or the other thing. So I'm not sure I count that on the one hand as great knowledge.
I understand that, absolutely. What about those, can we move ourselves away from the current collegiate generation, which we will get to in a second, but what about those of us who are of a different generation who still have that access to that internet and still possibly potentially pull viable or non-viable information as fact or fiction from that as determines faith, or as faith versus religion in a sense, or against it, or separation.
The second part of my response was going to be that it depends on the quality of the puller who's searching. And what we're about at the universities is training minds. I read, Paul Griffiths is a philosopher at Duke University who wrote this interesting book, Intellectual Appetites, and in it he talks about, in the medieval period, curiosity was a vice because it meant you were seeking after knowledge that was not yours to have. You were just, that's why it killed the cat, so you were constantly searching. He said what was the intellectual virtue of the age of the medieval period was studiousness, which as a virtue means that you were training your mind to be better able to equip genuine knowledge when you met it. So we have sort of this approach to the internet, more is better, all for all is free, open access to everything, but perhaps not enough concern for the training of character. And can I handle what it is that I'm accessing for free and so easily?
So in other words, Ling has misplaced, studiousness in a way. It's like,
Yeah, exactly.
That's-
I can Google it,
yeah.
And is that, and that is across generations, or are we looking at that, I mean,
I Google it.
I Google it. I know, my wife Googles it, I know that, so is that, I mean,
For me, it depends on what kind of questions you want to
Right.
ask.
Yes.
I think that may be at the basis of scientific reasoning and religious reasoning. As a psychologist, I ask myself, what is it that people are seeking when they believe in supernatural, life after death? And they're asking about coming to terms with meaning in life and the happenings of nature. Okay? If I were to use that framing, what's going on in life and what does all this mean? And not finding that, in some of us, who are scientists, in psychology especially, would try to answer some of these questions within the kind of scientific approach. But I don't think we do a very good job of able to answer that question for individuals who are really trying to come to terms with affinity, with death, with suffering, with the seeming randomness of one's future, good and bad and so forth, and morality. At one time, I think, people were listening to, and again I make a distinction now, between religious teaching, which is related to an institution, as to what's happening in our days, where people talk about spirituality a lot. I try to unpack the term in so many different ways, just as a psychologist to understand what exactly do people mean by spirituality. Coming from California, I have the luxury of asking a lot of folks, and they have all very different definitions. But I think that in each case, the experience of awe, right, experience of nature or people, things that is really, actually in English, awful sounds bad, but it's full of awe, right? Looking at something tends to lead us to think that there is a reality, or there is higher meaning than what we are living. And I think from a psychological standpoint, that may be an interesting motivation to look at. On top of that, there's a research project a colleague of mine did for many years, was to have folks at different times stand closer or further away from a mortuary. Right? So what he did was he interviewed people at different places, at different distance from the mortuary, and asked them questions. And what is most interesting is, closer you are to the mortuary, the more folks people talk about spirituality and faith.
so like tangibly, I'm like closer to death.
Yeah, and I think trying to, the reality that I'm going to die is so real, I immediately said, oh, okay, no, what is it? There must be something more to it.
That's crazy. I live literally across from a cemetery. I open my window up every day, and I'm not even a happy toilet.
Yeah, so see, I mean, that may be.
But see, again, now, like, I take it back to Brit. I mean, in this day and age, and I even post this out to the audience too, isn't it like, and did you see Tyson live when he did that, or did you find that on the internet?
I found it on the internet.
So isn't that something that we actually probably can go, if we want a specific answer, can't we just go find it then?
Wait, hang on, because I want to ask Margie a question.
Absolutely.
Because you work with mechanical engineers and you do design work. It seems to me that design is what happens when you can't completely answer. Is that right? Do you have to cure your students of that habit?
I think they use Google in the process of coming up with their answer. I mean, they need a lot of information to help inform their designs, and probably that's the first place they'll go to. In fact, I encourage it in some cases. So yeah, I mean, but it's an application of that knowledge that's important.
Okay. Anybody, I want to turn this over to the audience. Anybody want to mention anything in response to this, please? Absolutely.
I think that the internet hasn't replaced efforts.
Okay.
It has all the information. If you want to actually understand something, you still have to go out and find the information. The information happens to be much easier and fun. You can find more of it, but if you want to actually understand what you're talking about, you still have to research.
But isn't there a way to go down specific rabbit holes in the internet to find as much research that I think I want to find? Therefore, in this sense, I want to be able to own my own distinct voice I can just find it, right? Yes?
That's what happens when you start clicking links in the feeds.
Okay. Absolutely, that's absolutely fair. It's absolutely fair. Anybody else? Yes, in the
I
back.
have a question. So, just, because what I'm thinking of is sort of culturally, or maybe, so, for example, an older population maybe may not really kind of fit into this. So, people who, let's say you have an 80-year-old grandmother, she doesn't get on the internet. She faithfully goes to church every Sunday, every Wednesday evening. Her faith is strong. She doesn't get on the internet. She's not on social media. So when we say in our 21st century world, we're really talking about a room of people here who are on the internet and on the computer every day, as opposed to the 80-year-old or maybe even the 70-year-old person, or people who don't have access to the internet or social media every day. And I'm just wondering, when we talk about the correlation between the internet and religion in our 21st century, are people losing faith? You know, when you're talking about that, are you also talking about sort of that subset in society that have not lost their faith, that are not on the internet, or maybe other cultures who don't use social media? You know, so how are we, when you say our 21st century,
Absolutely.
we're sort of talking about this room as opposed to more globally different cultures. Do you agree?
I go ahead, absolutely.
Yeah, so that's really great. There are other correlations that we can find, that being one of them. Another correlation would be the fact that the more increase in use of internet is also an increase in, or I say decrease in knowledge of how our devices work, a decrease in knowledge of where they come from, or the fact of dirty supply chains in building the Samsung or the Apple phone or whatever it is. So there's all sorts of correlations. We might just say my ability to keep, as a rich Westerner, to own a smartphone, let's say, my ability to keep blinders on and not want to know where the supply chain comes from is correlation with my loss of rich religious life. Something that my 80-year-old relative may not have to deal with. So that the increase in technology is, creating or should create problems with my conscience and soul searching. And if it doesn't, that says something about me, does it not?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would like to throw in that internet is a lot of information coming from the outside, but I think that people in different cultures are rather living in different environments where there's very little information bombarding them. The kind of information they have to rely on would be really traditional beliefs, what they're taught, and sort of looking at themselves, thinking. So if I were to use a metaphor, it's like a computer that's sort of in a closed system. Right? It is reprocessing old information, even if it's in its different ways. And if you think about faith in something that is affirmed by this self-fulfilling kind of thinking, it's easier to maintain than when you have external bombardment of perspectives and information all the time that you have difficulty assessing. Right? So it tends to potentially erode that, but I really believe you could keep faith. And I go back to my hero, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, is a person that, in spite of everything happening, he could maintain faith until death. Right? That's psychologically something I'm interested in studying. Is how to keep faith in spite of this bombardment.
Jeff, just to kind of expand on what you said too, is that there are some religious cultures who do go to great lengths to protect their children from exposure to those diverse ways of thinking and to information from other sources for the sole purpose to protect them and to maintain their religious beliefs too. So I think that would be.
And one of the also other interesting things as well is that speaking on the older generation, the 80-year-old grandmother, there is much that we have to learn in our discussions about many things, not just the internet and faith religion in relation to that generation, because I think we've become very centralized in a certain time period where we like to reflect as we as the whole, when that isn't the truth for certain age demographics. And I think that was a really interesting point that you brought up regarding that. Right.
So there are things that that the 80-year-old grandmother can teach us, skills that are not bits of information that you can find by Googling them. As in cultures that have crafts like canoe building or whatever, pick your whatever your favorite.
About wisdom.
Yeah, exactly.
How about wisdom?
I'm not familiar with that. But carpentry and any sort of, the tactile, tacit knowledge that exists in your bodily memory,
Mhm.
dancing, right?
Mhm.
I mean, you can see videos of, but you need a coach, don't you? I mean,
Absolutely. Well, I'm interested in what Jack was just saying about this closed system metaphor, right? That there's a way in which, even the internet and access to a lot of information, we kind of self-select a closed system, even in all that information, right?
Absolutely.
We unfriend the person on Facebook who doesn't agree with us,
Doesn't.
right? Right.
But
So we
absolutely.
find ways
Well, that's what
to
happened
not
to me.
engage. We find ways to not engage in dialogue and question our own belief system, but in fact create our own closed system. So, I find that maybe we're setting up a false dichotomy. Maybe there is a way in which, we all kind of self-select closed systems of sorts.
Well, let's go ahead and bridge that then over to, we keep sort of talking about these hyper age of use of media, as well as much discussion was brought about a specific age demographic, which is our current college student and that current generation. So, one of the things that we find about today's, what I like to call, and we study a lot over at ArtStreet, is the YOLO generation, the idea that you only live once generation. And that's a whole nother debate for another time, because you'd be surprised about my perspectives on that. But, I think the faith is challenged a lot by this generation. And so, one of the things we have to remember is that culture can be seen as the surface medium through which people express their convictions and their collective identity. So if you understand this, it might be a little bit easier to help understand the current student population, because their culture is expressed by their observable behavior, their tattoos, how they talk, their slang, their clothing. So we need to kind of understand the worldview behind their lifestyle. I mean, I would hope that we would try to make that kind of connection to it. So, but if they live in this complex media-saturated society, where it's a part of their DNA, it is part of their DNA, whether we want it or not, where a lot of us think of it as, technology is a part of the development that has occurred during our lives, but that does not reflect the world in which we kind of live in, then technological development is inherent in shaping this youth culture. Can we agree with that, at least? Can we say that technology is inherent in developing this youth culture? Is that fair? Is that a fair assessment?
Sure.
Okay.
We're social cyborgs.
Okay. So, but then many postulate that the media forms an important basis to participate in culture and society in today's world. So, talking about many of us, where does one's faith lie that years of growth with said media and mediums will help this current generation separate what is fact and what perhaps is fiction? And that could be a big generalization too. It could be a very big assumption. But, and also on the same breath, whether we like it or not, this hypermedia world does influence many growing and maturing perspectives. And so, does it? How does it do? Anybody want to jump in there? I can, Dr. Jack, you ready to go for it?
My thought is that if you only live once, is an attitude towards one's life, right? It's already, if you frame it that way, you're talking about a cultural perspective that looks at life as ending here.
See, that's interesting, because I actually think of that as an actual, you only live once, I have to make the best of my situation immediately.
That's right. And I think that I want to bring back to the point, is that how we look at our finitude and what we do in this life has a lot to do, but I can't imagine life after death as a possibility, as a way of framing how I live life now, as in many religious communities do. Then my behavior changes. And I'm not so sure that young folks don't have faith or want to believe that there's more to life than this one. But I think their approach to it may be very different from what older folks might have. They may not look to traditional religious institutions for answer and recipe. They would like to seek answers for themselves, which is more individualistic. So I want to bring that up.
Absolutely. I think it's also fair about the Googling. The enabling of Googling allows the trust that they will actually hopefully use that. We have faith. again, in that they will use that Googling process to expand the ability to troubleshoot, to manage and navigate. Again, do we have as an older generation, where is our faith that they will be able to do that with trust? I guess is part of that first question, right? You were going to mention something?
Yeah, so I saw a book cover the other day on my shelf, book I hadn't read, but interesting book cover. It's by Wendell Berry, and the title was, "What are people for?" And that's a great question. That's probably the deepest question. And if a YOLO culture, we'll answer it by saying, life is a bucket list. That's all crossed off. If that's an answer, but I'm not sure they'll be very satisfied when they get to the end of the list.
Do we only think that every single person of that generation of college right now they build their life around a set bucket list?
Well, but the bucket list grows because they keep watching YouTube clips, whatever channel you're on.
So obviously up here, our faith is slightly wavering towards the current generation's ability to separate what is fact and fiction then. Okay. Now?
Well, I think also sometimes they will replace faith with reason.
Okay.
And not that I'm condoning that or thinking that's a great thing, but I think sometimes because of information that not only that they get from the internet, but from, I think our students have much more worldly experience than I ever had the opportunity to participate in when I was their age. But they see the world in a different way, and they can reasonably, through their intelligence and through their experience, figure out that life is a lot more than a bucket list, that relationships matter, and taking care of people matter, taking care of our world and our earth and our climate matter. And not only from a faith standpoint, but also from a standpoint that just from a survivability and living in this world without us all killing each other kind of a standpoint.
This is kind of a semantics question, but it's interesting to me that it's you only live once, right? Not I only live once, or, so I wonder, getting back to this idea about we, maybe there's a way in which the YOLO generation is really a collective YOLO, and it's, there's a lot of brilliance and potential creativity that comes from that perspective of seizing opportunities as they come and making the most of their time on this planet. And I think it's up to us as educators to have them expand that YOLO perspective, as you were just saying, expand that to help them, because I think it's just a process of maturation that we all went through. I think we all kind of, in our youth, had our own version of YOLO, I would hope, right? You're only young once.
Well, I also think there's a dynamic to that, because you're talking about, we're talking about this topic as it looks in the mirror of our own specific generational background, correct? Where we are now looking at, a phone, an iPod, whatever, as, again, like I mentioned, this tool. We always talk about it, I remember a time before, insert digital media piece here, right? Theirs is and is. It always has been. It becomes an appendage, right? Therefore, they have a much different faith and reason in something that is much different than how our faith and reason based on our generational impact is. So again, I wonder, is there any, I'm trying to gauge the panel here and trying to find out, are we in the bed that we don't really think that they're going to mature past this point, or is there a point that this sense of DNA in their body will only become stronger, more clear, and influence and inform generations that come, because they will have now experienced this as it is, not a was? Yeah, absolutely.
As a member of the millennial generation,
I was wondering if you were going to raise your hand.
yeah, this is really interesting to me because, yes, I am a person who was born on social media, I seem to say, which, by the way, my 80-year-old grandmother is also on Twitter, and actually she made me get a Twitter, so that's a different issue. But as somebody who's grown up on this and has so much access to all of these different things at any given time, from my phone, from my computer, from any variety of sources, it's so important to have the self-exploration part of it. You're having so many people tell you what to think and what to do. You're having so many headlines say, 26 things you need to do before you die, 14 things you need to do in college, that eventually you get to the point of saying, this is what I need to do. And while I may have a bucket list, I also want self-fulfillment. It's a mixture of those two things to a point of it's neither here nor there, it's both.
Now, is that something that you can, I'll put you and your generation on the spot, now, is that something that you feel that your entire generation feels? That those
I
steps
mean-
are in place for them?
I mean, I don't think everybody right now.
Okay.
I definitely have people who are 100% YOLO all the way. And there are many people that at least I like to hang out with who are going through these periods of self-discovery. And really, I think for future generations, it'll be about developing a really thick filter of what are we letting in and how many sources are we letting dictate what we do. Because
So-
otherwise, we're just going to be malleable to anything.
So, hearing you speak, I feel like I have great faith that the futures will be that way. And somebody who actually has 60 of 70 students like Maggie in a very specific class, I actually do have that much faith in them that they will have and be able to design. I believe they actually do have the ability to find fact and what is fiction. I think that sometimes that fact and fiction doesn't always jive with what we were growing up on. So,
Well, I think that there's no reason that saying you only live once as part of how you live means that you only need to care about what happens while you're alive. I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that and then still be someone who's satisfied and thinks about the future. Even if you might not believe in anything spiritual, you could still care about it.
you guys have brought in some great. Oh, yes, please, jump in, please.
I was just gonna
No
say,
worries.
Brian, I also have faith, is it Maggie? In Maggie and her generation, absolutely, and I feel like if you don't have faith, you should, in this generation, you shouldn't be an educator.
Right?
And on that note, I think it still doesn't diminish our responsibility to Maggie and to her generation to help them in that process of self-fulfillment. So the process of self-fulfillment finds a we. I'm really attracted to thinking about this we again, right? Because even as you speak about fulfillment, it's still an individual fulfillment. And I don't know if community is a part of how you'd identify self-fulfillment, but I think that is what's interesting, and that's what a lot of people turn to faith, capital F, for, right? Is that sense of collective community, and who is the we here?
That's
So-
what I want to ask. What is the we, though? Is the we a generation, or is it a we generations? And I think that's a really interesting.
Before that, I just want to say that I will not use the word faith the way you use it. I'm, putting on my hat status.
By all means, absolutely.
I would look at it from a probabilistic statement as a given, if the number of young persons say that, given that I can estimate, given the probability, that a certain percentage will excel and do this and do that. But it's not faith. I want to really get to that.
What is that, though, then? Because then you're breaking it down to somewhat that feels very kind of isolating and cold.
Faith to me is a position you take that something you do not know yet will happen, okay? And so if it's based on some level of evidence, we're going back to observation and so
Absolutely,
forth,
absolutely.
we are really talking about judgment based on probability. We may not use those words. But when we're talking about religious faith, in a true sense, I don't know God, I don't know life after death, I don't have any experience of that other than a commitment of saying, I will believe in it, right? So that to me, qualitatively, is different than a probabilistic belief.
So then, can I bring back something that Pinnell brought up? Where does spirituality though fit into that kind of, is that somewhere in that faith reason dynamic? Like, I'm just curious. Yeah, I'm just asking. It was brought up, so I'm just curious.
So I'll respond, at least see the conversation, I guess. The question is asking us, where does our faith lie? So faith needs an object. I don't think technology is a proper object for faith. I don't think that technology is our savior. But we fund it like it were. And we herald the iPhone 6 as the new Messiah. I mean, this is the way we get above time. So, but there's kind of an ideology in the West that we want to split the difference. We want to have community and peace and serenity, but we also want prosperity and new things and experiences. choices, and it's kind of like you can't have both. So in the meantime, we're going to throw all of our money at technology, hoping that someday technology will deliver both. That's a problematic place to place our faith.
Well, that's fair, because I would have to see that that is inherently, it's part of the nature of this generation, that this is, that drive for technology at times is changing whatever you want to talk about, perspectives and views around their of faith and reason, and what they have faith and what they have reason in. We should say could very well be technology more than anything else at times. So we got about 10 minutes left, roughly. Yes, sir.
I sit here and I wonder if this conversation was like held 20 years ago,
Yes.
what kind of shape would have taken? So what you have done, if you were interested in this guy's interview, you came here, had it printed, distributed to us, and while some of us are discussing it, some of us would have read what this guy said and everything. Instead, what you did is show us a millisecond what you want us to show, how you wanted to drive the conversation. And now we don't know anything what's going on because, you know.
Sure.
So basically, you manipulated the media now for your own good, because to lead the conversations the way you want to lead it.
Okay. Fair enough. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
I have sort of an overarching question about, like, we assume from the beginning that the reduction of stated religion is really leading to the reduction of faith, but is that really the case? There are a lot of people who say they're religious, but probably aren't faithful, and there are probably people who say they aren't religious, but are faithful. And similarly, is what our culture says we value, what the media says we value, is that actually what individuals value? Because I don't think anyone actually believes that the iPhone 6 is the new Messiah.
Exaggerate. But
There was somebody who said that.
this is Jack's favorite line, so let me step in before Jack responds. Because I think what you say is important. I think what we're talking about is whether it's spirituality or religion or ethics or old style community. We're talking about the shaping of people's character and their practical wisdom, how to live well. Right? And that's the question is where do we find them? Some will find that to be the institution of church that is 2,000 years old or 1,300 years old, depending on what your views are. Your turn.
Well, yeah, I like the idea of living well, and that itself needs to be unpacked, what it means. But in terms of going back to my age, I'm talking about self-fulfillment, right? The term that young may or may not use. The idea that we look for ways to live a meaningful life, a fulfilling life, meaningfully, using a general way, I think is an impetus every generation. Living a meaningful life in the face of the fact that in earlier days people died much earlier, death was much more of a companion than today. We are still trying to find a way of living in a more fulfilling way. Now, if some of us look at the computer as a way, I don't know how you can find great fulfillment other than immediately getting some titillation or excitement depending on what you're watching. But the question as to how we live in terms of a life that's character, or to live in a community where there is civility, stability, care, and so forth. Again, existentially, existing in just about any society, any groups of individuals. Those questions, I would like to say that I'm also a social psychologist. The social psychologists, sociologists have all the answer, right? You take up courses. Now, I don't think we have all the answers. I think we do provide information that each one of us and each group of us can study and make some decisions and take a stand as to which set of information we choose that to apply in our lives is more fulfilling. I don't think that will ever change. Right? I don't think we will, just because we have lots of information about how people behave, all right, we will all of a sudden be machines and follow and says, according to so-and-so study in 1987, I should be acting this way. I don't think we do that. I think that we do take this information into consideration and make some decisions about what we mean by fulfilling life. if it's having a good relationship, if it's serving others in the world, if that's fulfilling, all right? Then for me, the question, and for the panel is, where does the impetus, the motivation to serve people or to care, all right? Can it come from science? Or is it something out of need, or is it out of choice?
Any last reaction?
So I've been listening to this about the different generations somehow in technology, and maybe I deal with a group of students who is self-selecting and that they're taking classes on sustainability. But they assure me that many of their generation have a different outlook than my generation. It's my generation is the one that was obsessed with technology and getting big cars and having big houses and doing all this stuff. And it's their generation that is the one that's more willing, even though they have all this technology, that doesn't seem to be the motivating factor. It's there and it's part of them, but the motivation is more, again, for these students to serve, to go out and do something meaningful with their lives, to realize that they have to do something about environmental issues or other things. And so it's almost like that media is so, that the various technologies are so common to them, they don't have to think about it anymore. It's just there. But I don't know, that's just when I ask students.
In the back.
Well, one thing that strikes me is that, and I may be wrong, but I don't believe any of us are born with faith. We learn about faith as we grow up. And it seems to me that 100 years ago, the way we learned about faith was from our parents, and it was a God-fearing population in the United States. And therefore, the concept of faith revolved around spirituality and God and religion. But as the years have rolled by in the United States of America, parents are not so prone, because they have different ideas as they've grown up, about faith in God. And so a lot of people growing up today learn about faith in a different way. They learn about faith, about having faith in the future, or faith in a friend, or faith or hope about this. So the concept of faith has changed so much in the last 100 years that it makes the conversation, it has given entry to reason versus faith. Because 70 years ago, we probably wouldn't be talking about this.
Absolutely. As last comment is a great comment. Let's go ahead and all comment on that if you guys want to. We're running out of time. We can carry this conversation to the other room too. But does anybody want to sort of tie that one up, or at least try to? Any thoughts?
I just would like to say I agree with you that we need to really look at the phenomenology of the term faith, the experience of faith over the generations. Whether it's a faith based on unknown, based on what we are taught, and faith that emerges from experience and our own discovery, they really qualitatively are different. So I don't want to juxtapose faith as though it were a monolithic definition with reason, which is monolithic. They are not that distinct.
And I'm just thinking about faith as a commodity in a way, that, I've seen like t-shirts say, got faith. And, the ways in which like jewelry, you can get the scripted faith and wear it on your neck. And, this kind of idea that it's something, not necessarily that you grow into or evolve into, but that you can somehow procure is interesting to me.
And thanks, Vicki, for those comments. I think that studying the grammar of faith is really part of what I do in the field of theology. Because we would say that faith, you can have tons of faith and direct it at a very clear object. I have faith that this quarter-inch sheet of ice will hold me up. Oops, it didn't. I have a lot of faith. But other people may have very, very small faith, like my, international student, a friend that comes from Africa, and I'm from Minnesota, and I show them ice for the first time. No, we actually can drive our cars on this. No, not a chance. Well, yeah, so the object is different, and but it's related to the quality of faith, and so how we exercise those terms, how we develop trust in each other, and I agree, that's very important.
And I don't know, I don't really know how to answer this. I guess to some degree I feel that you are born with faith and you learn religion. Because I do think faith, at least my definition of faith, and this could be a grammar thing, is something from within. I think how you choose to practice that is your religion. And I think that's very much learned by your upbringing and your culture.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming over today.